joining us now to try to figure this out. NBC News White House correspondent Vaughn Hilliard. In Berlin, NBC News international correspondent Raf Sanchez following the German elections there, what they mean for all of this, and Puck founding partner and Washington correspondent Julia Ioffe. So Macron there sounded very positive, Vaughn. He was clearly trying to play to Donald Trump's vanity, talking about how good of a partner he's been, the memories they've had together. He was also talking about how Europe needed to stand up more, talking about the minerals deal that Donald Trump wants to make with Ukraine, widely panned by foreign policy experts, but some moves from Macron to say, hey, listen, this is not such a bad idea. Can you just straighten this out for us? What can we say it appears has come from this meeting?
Right, because to a certain extent, there's an acknowledgement that if a rare earth minerals deal were to be signed between Ukraine and the United States, effectively that would increase the U.S.'s own interest in having what would amount to a security agreement to protect Ukraine in the future, because they would be protecting their own resources. And of course, that is where you see President Macron wholly understanding that they are negotiating with somebody in President Trump whose commitment to Ukraine is rather imperative to the future of Ukraine's defenses and the region's defenses against further Russian aggression. And the posture, I think, that you saw not only during this press conference, but also the 30 minutes in the Oval Office just about 2 hours ago, I think is striking, because in many ways you saw President Macron tout the relationship that the G7 has in their phone call that they engaged in this morning, but then in there also the bilat between President Macron and President Trump here this afternoon. And the one moment where you saw him interject was when President Trump boosted the idea that somehow the U.S. had invested almost 3 times the amount of aid to Ukraine than the EU has, and that the EU was doing it in the form of a loan when the U.S. was getting the bad end of the deal, when President Macron jumped in to set the record straight and saying that the EU has in fact contributed 60% of the financial assistance to Ukraine's efforts, and that it has not been in the form of a loan, to which you saw President Trump sort of shrug there. But that was the first time that we have seen a foreign leader really push back against a claim made by the president. But other than that, you saw by and large him wholly understanding in his agreement with President Trump in the direction in which these negotiations are moving.
Julie, what was also interesting is that Macron, who, to be fair, had kept up communications with Vladimir Putin longer than pretty much anybody else after the war started. He said his line was what happened in Bucha, the slaughter there, the raping, the awful stories that happened from Russian soldiers on Ukrainians in Bucha, and that's when he stopped. But now he's saying on this 3-year anniversary that it is time to re-engage with Vladimir Putin. Would he be saying that if Donald Trump did not win the White House?
I doubt he would be. I think that this is basically him responding, as he said, to a new American reality. He addressed this head on in this press conference. He said, I stopped talking to him because he was lying, essentially. And to Vaughn's point, Macron talked about how we tried to negotiate peace with him in 2014. And he didn't even have to finish the rest of the sentence, because we know where we are now 11 years later. We're still, Ukraine is still at war with Russia, right? Despite any negotiations Putin has entered into, which is what everybody has been warning about. But I guess Macron's point is, if Trump is going to be negotiating with Putin anyway, then Europe should be at the table, because A, it affects Europe's security first and foremost, at least when it comes to the U.S. and the West, and also because they have underwritten 60% of Ukrainian aid. So, it's either you can condemn the talks all you want, or you join them and try to get your point across, get yourself heard. There have been
sanctions on Russia now for 3 years, pretty heavy sanctions, but they have been able to continue waging this war. They've been getting help from the North Koreans. They've been getting help from the Iranians and from China. Could they continue on that path? If the U.S. was still standing by NATO, still standing by Ukraine, staying on the path it had been on until Donald Trump was elected, would there come a point where Vladimir Putin would be left with no other option than to pull out of the war himself?
I doubt that. there have been several prognoses that 2025 was going to be the year that the going got easier for Ukraine, both because some of the weapons they ordered early on in the war, again, American weapons made in America by Americans in America, would be coming online, would be shipped to Ukraine finally. And because Russia would be running out of money. It's not just that the North Koreans and the Chinese are helping them. It's also that India, for example, is buying their oil. And countries like Turkey and other Central Asian countries like Kazakhstan, Armenia are helping Russia bypass sanctions by being kind of shadow importers for Russia. And one of the reasons that Russia is able to pay for this war, to continue to pay for this war, is it does have vast energy resources that the world still needs. And most of the world does not really care about this war the way that the West does. And Russia's just spending. Inflation is crazy in Russia right now. It's just been, the economy has been flush with cash because of this defense spending. And there have been prognoses that this money would run out. But I don't know that that alone would be enough for Putin to stop fighting, because he doesn't care about economics first. He cares about this imperialist project first.
So the question is, if the U.S. does completely back out, and I know French President Emmanuel Macron is saying, you know, we had a good meeting today, and I believe this is a turning point, but Donald Trump is very famous for always agreeing with the last person that he talks to. So we'll see what happens after this. If Europe had to stand up on its own, I'll give this question to Raf Sanchez, are they going to be able to do that? Because the question has been, is there public support among European nations to keep helping Ukraine? And I think the German election was something of a test of that. Can you infer anything from what happened there?
So, Katie, anecdote, not data, but you'll be able to see behind me the iconic Brandenburg Gate lit up here in the very heart of Berlin in the colors of the Ukrainian flag. And actually just finished here was a very large, very noisy rally of several thousand Germans turning out to show their solidarity with Ukraine 3 years into the full-scale invasion. I would say these people were here to protest President Putin, but a lot of them were also there to protest President Trump. We saw a lot of signs in English, one of them saying, Putin's Russia is the aggressor in Ukraine, which is a pointed message, given that over the weekend, several senior Trump administration officials really were not able to say those words, that Putin's Russia started this war. In terms of capabilities, Katie, the Europeans are nowhere near where they would need to be to stand alone militarily without the United States. They're very open about that. Absolutely critical assets like air refueling, missile defense, certain types of long-term missiles, long-range missiles. The Europeans are just almost completely dependent on the United States. But what you are seeing here in Europe is an increasing sense of urgency about breaking that dependence. It was very interesting watching the French president from here in Berlin taking a sort of non-confrontational approach to Donald Trump, trying to flatter him where he could, point towards areas of agreement, because the likely next leader of Germany last night, just minutes after exit polls pointed to his election victory, was absolutely blunt in his assessment of the crisis in the U.S.-European relationship. His name is Friedrich Merz. He is from the center-right. He's the head of the Christian Democrats, Angela Merkel's old party. His party got the most votes. They're likely going to lead the next coalition government. But just a few minutes after that exit poll, he went into a German television studio and he said it is very clear to him that the Trump administration does not care about the fate of Europe. He said it is going to be his top priority as the leader of Europe's largest economy to strengthen Europe so it can forge an independent path from the United States. He said he's not at all confident that NATO will be able to continue in its current form. And he talked about the fact that both Vice President Vance and Elon Musk pretty openly supported the far right in this German election. And he went on to say that the election interference from Washington was just as shameful as the election interference from Moscow. So these are very stark words from a traditional American ally, from a leader on the center right who really feels that the relationship between the United States and its NATO allies in Western Europe is in a very, very dark place right now.